Okay, so now let's get into the S3 security. And there's a ton of things we have to see. So the first one that is obvious is how to encrypt objects in history. And you should know the four methods of encrypting adversity in history already. But just as a reminder, there is a SE S3, and this is to encrypt S3 objects using the keys handled and managed by AWS, entirely managed by AWS. There is SSE KMS, where you leverage your own KMS keys, your KMS service to manage encryption keys. We have a bit more control over these things, and the API calls made to retrieve the objects that are encrypted with SSE KMS will appear in the CloudTrail and KMS specifics API calls. So now then you have the SSEC where you want to manage your own encryption keys, and we have seen from before that this encryption key can come from example from like the CloudHSM, and then you have the client side encryption where you want to handle all the encryption from the client directly, and S3 doesn't even know that the content is encrypted. You just send the data encrypted already into S3 and you retrieve it client side. So and you will have the decrypted client side as well, on the client side as well. Finally, in Glacier, all the data is by default AES to AES 256 encrypted, which is the same kind of encryption, which is the same kind of encryption, like the has SSC S3, and the key is the under AWS control. So this is something you should already know that it's good refresh. So SSC S3 and the AES 256. That's the Glacier is by default AES 256. That is the SSC S3 encrypted. So next we have encryption in. Next we have encryption in transits. So AWS will expose multiple things. It will expose an HTTP endpoint which is non-encrypted, and that's not recommended to use it, or as GDP's endpoint, which provides you by default encryption in flight, because S means SSL and secure, so you are free to use which one you want, but obviously HTTPS will be the recommended, and in case you are using something like SSC, you have to use HTTPS because you are sending the encryption key over the internet, and you don't want to you want someone to do a man-in-the-middle attack to retrieve your encryption key, because you have used only HTTP. So we have seen that encryption in flight also is called the SSL or TLS interchangeably, and we are good to go with the encryption and encryption in flight. So next next we have events in the S3 buckets, and so they are the multiple ones. So the first one is the S3 access logs, which will give you the detailed records of all the requests made in the S3 buckets, and it might take hours to deliver, and it might be delivered to another S3 bucket, and it might be incomplete. So this is from the documentation that it could take hours to even the deliver. It could be even the incomplete. So this is the best effort, but it's still a really good access log to get into the S3. S3 event notification now, which is to retrieve notification whenever certain events happen in your bucket. For example, new objects are being created, others are being removed, objects are being stored, or there is a replication event happening. And the destination is of these S3 events can be SNS, SQS, QE, and Lambda. And so typically these S3 event notifications are going to be delivered within seconds, okay? But it can sometimes take a minute or two, or you will receive a notification for every single object if you have enabled versioning on your S3 buckets. But if somehow you haven't enabled the versioning, but in the very rare occasion that you are doing two writes at the same time on the same object, then you may receive just one notification, not two. And that is being outlined in the documentation. But for the rest, you will receive the notification for every single object. insert it into your S3 buckets. So now for the trusted advisor, check the bucket permission. So this will be helpful, for example, to know if your bucket is being public and you have CloudWatch events where you need to enable CloudTrail, objective and logging on S3 first, and then the events will be happening in the CloudWatch events, and the targets can be anything like the cloud events can send to Lambda, SQS, SNS, etc. So this is how you can capture in so many different ways all the events happening in your S3 buckets. Okay, so next S3 security. So how would you secure your buckets? So well, first you have user-based security where you have IAM policies, and by setting up an IAM policy on one of your user, you allow it to access a specific bucket. You allow it to access a specific bucket, and your resource-based policy, which is the bucket policy. So this is the bucket-wide rules from the S3 console, and we have seen that it's a very helpful when we have cross-account access, because it allows the account who wants to access the S3 buckets and not to assume a role and give up his permissions. Then we have the object ACL, finer grain, and the finally bucket access control list, which is less common, and the exam would probably will not talk to you about the ACL, wanted to talk about the S3 bucket policies, because this is the way forward for the exam from now on. So okay, now we'll be talking about the S3 bucket policies in bit more depth. So you should use an S3 bucket policy in order to grant public access to the buckets, or force objects should be encrypted, upload, or grant access to another account, cross account access, and you can get conditions on many different things, and this is a very important to remember those. The first one is the public or elastic IP. Optional conditions. The first one is the public or elastic IP. It's called the source IP, and this is only valid for the public and elastic IP, not for the private IP. So it's possible that the exam will try to trick you into thinking that S3 bucket policies for the source IP condition can be applied to the private IP, but this is not the case. Okay, S3 is a public service, and you access it publicly for now, and so the only thing you can do source IP is on public and the elastic IP. But there is another option, it's called the source VPC endpoints, and this is when you define a VPC endpoint. We saw this in the next slide, next slide or one after that. This is very helpful when you have a private access to your S3 buckets, and you want to say, okay, only IP is coming from to your S3 buckets, and you want to say, okay, only IP is coming from these VPC endpoints, or these VPCs are allowed. But again, this is not only by IP, this is by VPC or VPC endpoint. Okay, so then we have CloudFront origin identity. So it's possible to have a condition on saying only a CloudFront distribution within the origin identity is able to access my S3 bucket policy. And finally, you can have conditions on multi-factor authentication. If you want to see many different S3 bucket policies, please you can even go through this documentation, this link, so to you can know a little bit more about if somewhat I was not made these S3 bucket policy a little more familiar for you. So go through this link. So now pre-signed URLs, and what are those and when do we use those? So you can generate pre-signed URLs using the SDK or the CLI, and this for downloads or for uploads. They are both valid, and the idea is that you signed these URLs and your IAM credentials, and so whoever has these pre-signed URL has the exact same rights that you were given, that IAM credential were given. Okay, so when you created the pre-signed URL, so it's valid for a default of 1 hour, but you can change your timeout with the expires in the arguments, and users will inherit the permissions of the person who created the generated the URL. for get or put. Get is for the download and put is for the upload. So when we use presigned URLs, we will use them. For example, if we want to allow a login users to only download a premium video on yours, so you get on demand, or allow an ever changing list of users to download files by regenerating URL dynamically. So also, if he wants to allow users to upload a file temporarily to a very precise location in our buckets, and then make sure that they don't have any writes after this, so we can even use the presigned URL in such a case. Okay, so now let's talk about the VPC Endpoint Gateway for S3. So let's say that you have a VPC and in it you have an EC2 instance, it's in the public subnet, and want to access an S3 bucket. Now the S3 buckets has a public access, and therefore you need to go through an internet gateway for the EC2 instance to get public IP. Okay, so go through the internet gateway and then get access through the public internet to the S3 buckets. Now the S3 bucket can have a bucket policy, and we can filter the have a condition for the bucket policy by using something like the source IP, AWS source IP, and this must be a public IP or an elastic IP, which are the public, by the way. So that's the option 1. The option 2 is we have an instance in a private subnet, and we want to access the S3 bucket policy. Now there's a way where we could have this private instance go through the NAT gateway, and this public subnet go through the internet gateway, and then go through the public route. So you will go up and swap like up and then right, but there is a better way. Here, because here you go through the public internet and you are texting your bucket. Texting your bucket publicly. So another way to do is to use a VPC Endpoint Gateway. So as have been shown in the slide, VPC Endpoint Gateway, and you define these VPC Endpoint Gateway, and then all the traffic remains on the AWS network. It stays private, and now the idea is that you can access your S3 buckets directly through this VPC Endpoint Gateway. And if you wanted to use a S3 bucket policy, you could have two conditions. The first one is the AWS source VPC, where you can specify one or few VPC endpoints that is allowed to go through to access these buckets, or the AWS source VPC to encompass all the possible VPC endpoints that belong to a specific VPC. And so these would be two very important conditions you remember for your S3 buckets. Number one is source IP, which is the public IP, and the second is the source VPC or the source VPC endpoint, when you have a VPC endpoint to access your S3 bucket. Source VPCE, AWS source VPCE, that's the bucket policy we are talking about to access your S3 buckets. I hope that this is going to make a sense, and I hope this diagram is something that shed a lot of light on these S3 bucket policies and networking conditions. Okay, finally, for extra security, let's talk about the object logs and the Glacier vault log. So they are very similar as S3 object log, which allows you to adopt a warm read write many model, which is to block an object version deletion for a specified amount of time. So you have this certainty that will never ever be deleted. Okay, so it's the same Glacier vault log here, where you end up the same model, and your luck the policy for the future edit. So that is that it can no longer be changed, and any object put into the Glacier will never ever be deleted, which is extremely helpful if you have compliance and data retention requirements, and you need to prove these to auditors, and then it's a great way to show that so that the object will never ever be deleted. So very simple to take an object, put into the vault, v in a vault, and lock that vault, and the object can never ever be deleted. So that runs up everything for the S3 security. So there should be a lot of things that you already knew, that probably one or two new things in there. And remember, going to the exam, the very important things is all about the details. So everything I'm saying about the details is what you should be paying attention on. Alright, so that's it for this lecture. I hope you liked it, and I will see you in the next one.